Good morning.
Good morning.
The scripture lesson that I will be referencing today comes from Isaiah chapter 62, verses 1 to 5. It is understood that this scripture was written after the 587 fall of Jerusalem and the exile. The high hopes and expectations of the exiled refugees returning to Jerusalem to build the second temple had been replaced with bitter disillusionment and division. Deep conflict and disagreement about how to govern and who to include and who to exclude left God's people wondering about God's promise to act in their behalf. To them, God seemed indifferent and silent amid their questions, their confusion, and their struggles. It sounds a lot like our world today, doesn't it? Many refugees have come to try to get into our country and had their hopes and expectations dashed because they were returned to their country of origin, leaving them disillusioned. Deep conflicts and disagreements about who to include and who to exclude and who is to lead our country has left our nation in turmoil. For some, God has seemed indifferent and silent. During the pandemic, there have been questions, confusion, and suffering, very similar feelings to those felt by the people in our Isaiah scripture. Last June, President Steve Vesey spent 2 hours with the Evangelist on a Zoom meeting in Independence, and the rest of us were from all over the world. And during those 2 hours, he shared with us his thoughts about lessons that we are learning from the pandemic. He said when he originally started preparing for that meeting, he was going to say lessons we have learned. But as the pandemic went on and on and on, he had to change it to what lessons we are learning, because we are still learning lessons about the pandemic. President Vesey said that the one fundamental truth that we are learning is the inherent interrelatedness of all human beings, one with another and with our environment. I'd like to elaborate on that thought about interrelatedness a little bit. There's a Buddhist monk who is also a peace activist who has written, I think, some wise words to share with us about the interrelatedness of everything and the interconnection between us. He uses a piece of paper for his example. He says, I see a cloud in this piece of paper. Without the cloud, there would not be rain. And without the rain, there would not be trees, and the trees would not grow. And without trees, we could not make paper. So the cloud is essential for us to have paper. If we didn't have the cloud, we wouldn't have paper. And then he says, if you look a little deeper in it, you can notice that there's also sunshine in the piece of paper. Because if we did not have sunshine, the trees wouldn't grow. And if we don't have the trees, we wouldn't have this sheet of paper. And if we continue to look even deeper, we would find a logger in this piece of paper, because the logger cuts down the trees, takes them to the mill so that they can be transformed into paper. And so he sees a logger in this paper also. And if we look a little deeper, we could even see some wheat in this piece of paper, because the logger has to have his daily bread in order to exist. And so the wheat is made into the daily bread, which keeps the logger alive, so he can cut the trees and take them to the mill to have them transformed into paper. So when we look at things this way, we can see that all of these things are essential for this sheet of paper to exist. Everything coexists with this sheet of paper. Let us not forget our interconnectedness, as Steve Vesey suggested at Evangelist session. What is good for one of us can be good for all of us. And what is bad for one of us can also be bad for all of us. Another lesson that Steve Vesey mentioned was that with the cessation of in-person worship, we had to accelerate our online ministries. Thanks to John and Jim and Richard and Miranda, we were able to do that quite rapidly. I think we only missed one Sunday between the time that we had to close down the church for in-person worship, and we just missed one Sunday, and then we were up and running with our online ministries. So we know how important online ministries are. And even though we are back with in-person worship, we're still going to include those online worships during the rest of the time. We need to plan our worship, our events, our conferences, everything that we do so that everyone can be included. And online ministry is the way to do that. Even with a mass migration to online communications for work, for education, for healthcare, for shopping, and for entertainment, Steve Vesey said that there has emerged a growing hunger for authentic community. I want to share with you his exact words. He said, community formation is an intentional spiritual journey of life together that embodies Jesus's central message of love of God and neighbor. The pandemic left us craving for that kind of experience long before it was safe for us to come back to in-person worship. I'm so thankful that we had Zoom to bridge the gap for us when we could not meet in person and only had the option of meeting online. The pandemic has also revealed that the church is not the building or what happens in the building. The church remained engaged in vital ministries all the way through the pandemic, providing care and community formation. The church is a way of living, giving, serving, growing, and relating every day. Hate speech and violence have increased considerably during the pandemic. Stress and fear have surfaced deeply embedded biases that have lurked in our institutions, sometimes for centuries. During the pandemic, many of us have learned more about the inequalities and injustices in our societies than perhaps we knew before the pandemic began. In his book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, Noah Harari, a Jewish man who teaches at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, makes this statement: property is a prerequisite for long-term inequality. Let me say that again. Property is a prerequisite for long-term inequality. In another book entitled Teaching Black History to White People, Leonard Moore, who happens to be a professor at the University of Texas in Austin, cites some examples that confirm the message, the statement that Harari makes in his book about property being a prerequisite for long-term inequalities. Now, Leonard Moore is a longtime Monopoly player, and he thinks he's good at it. And so he uses Monopoly, a Monopoly game, as an example to confirm the statement that Mr. Harari made in his book. So he says, let's just pretend this. Let's say 6 white colleagues and I decide to play a game of Monopoly. And so we each choose the token that we're going to use to go around the board. And each of my 6 white colleagues is given $1,500 to start the game. They give me $750. And they say, Leonard, there's a special rule for you. You have to roll 20 times before you can buy any property. Now you can still go around the board. You can pay rent. You can pay taxes. And of course you can go to jail because you're Black, but you can't buy any property until you have rolled 20 times. So guess what? By the time I have rolled 20 times, he says, there's no property to buy. They've already bought all the property that's available. And the people who are observing the game say, Leonard, why don't you have any money or property? And Leonard says, because the rules of the game were tilted against me. And then they say, Leonard, that's just an excuse. You want the government to take care of you. You don't want to work. And that, he says, is part one. But there's another part. Here's part two. Part two, my 6 colleagues and I decide that we need to take a break for dinner. And so we have our children come and take our places, and they can continue to play the game while we're out to dinner. So he says, my daughter Lauren takes my place playing the game, and each of the kids of my colleagues come and take their places. So those 6 white colleagues of mine pass down their property and money to their kids to play with. My daughter Lauren, he says, has no money or property because I've been discriminated against. And so her friends say to her, Lauren, why don't you have any money or property? And she says, well, you should know that they discriminated against my daddy. That's why I don't have any property and money. And then they say, Lauren, that happened a long time ago. You can't blame us. Leonard Moore says that that example pretty much explains the Black experience in the South since the Civil War. The legacy still exists. He also tells a story of an African-American family in 1950 who went to a suburb called Highland Park in Dallas to try to buy a house. Now, they were unable to buy the house in Highland Park, but they were able to buy a house in a suburb called Oak Cliff, which at that time was a middle-class neighborhood. Now, they still were able to buy a house, but they weren't able to buy the house they wanted because of racism. The house that they wanted to buy in Highland Park would now be worth $3.5 million. The house that they were able to buy because they were forced to because of racism is now worth only $500,000. So when we talk about the legacy of segregation and Jim Crow, we have to remember that for 60 to 70 years in the state of Texas, Black people were prevented from operating in the economic mainstream. He says that he doesn't want white folks to feel guilty. He just wants them to understand the history. Because if you haven't really understood the history in America or understood that the history of this state, you can't understand anything about it until you know the Black history. He isn't trying to change anybody's idea about how to vote or how to think about certain issues. He just wants them to respect the perspectives of other people. Now we must ask ourselves, how are we going to think and act differently when it comes to seeing and understanding better the perspectives of other people? On this Racial Justice Day, I think Leonard Moore's examples give us plenty of food for thought. The prophecy of Isaiah allows us to imagine a time when God's promises will be fulfilled and people will no longer feel desolate and forgotten. But will have strength to go on. He uses us as we are. He uses both our weaknesses and our strengths to help him fulfill his divine purposes. As we look for things to come, we can be assured that God will continue to bring light into the world. He will bring light at the darkest of life's circumstances. As we have learned from the pandemic, there are lessons for us to learn. There have been rays of light shining through the darkness, through ministries of peace, reconciliation, and healing of the spirit. God's promises can be trusted. He is faithful even when his people are not. God calls us to live in communities of love, hope, joy, and peace, so we can care for the poor, the marginalized, and the refugee, because God cares passionately for all of his creation. I share with you these words from Doctrine and Covenants 162. Do not be discouraged. You have not been promised an easy path, but you have been assured that the Spirit that calls you will also accompany you. Listen together to one another without judgment, prejudgment, or predisposition. Do not assume that the answer to matters of conflict have yet been perceived. I think those are very important words. Do not assume that the answers to matters of conflict have yet been perceived. There is much to be done. Reason together and love one another, and the spirit of truth will prevail. From the earliest days, you have been given a sacred principle that declares the inestimable worth of all persons. Do not forget, the one who created all humankind grieves at the shameful divisions within the human family. A prophetic people must work tirelessly to tear down walls of separation and to build bridges of understanding. As we look ahead to the new year, I want to share a message that my husband Bruce found on our Nextdoor message board this week I thought was appropriate for me to end with today. It says, "Welcome to Flight 2022. We are prepared to take off into the new year. Please make sure your positive attitude and gratitude are secured and locked into the upright position. All self-destruct devices, pity, anger, selfishness, and resentment should be turned off at this time. All negativity, hurt, and discouragement should be put away. Should you lose your positive attitude under pressure during the flight, reach up and pull down a prayer. Prayers are automatically activated with faith. Once your faith has been activated, you can assist other passengers who have little faith. There will be no baggage allowed on this flight. God, our captain, has cleared us for takeoff. Destination, greatness. Wishing you a happy new year filled with new hope, new joy, and new beginnings. Blessings to each of you as you continue your journey into the new year."